I'm happy to have Crystal Dorsey with us today. Crystal is the Local Government Audit Manager in the Colorado Office of the State Auditor, or OSA. The OSA tracks over 4,000 Colorado local governments for compliance with the local government audit law, which requires submission of an annual independent financial audit to the OSA. Crystal and her team review audit reports and requests for exemption from audit for compliance with generally accepted accounting principles and state statutes. Before joining OSA, Crystal spent 13 years in governmental accounting with the city of Golden. And before that, she was with a CPA firm auditing local governments in Colorado. Crystal holds a Bachelor of Science degree in accounting from Regis University and is a licensed CPA in Colorado. I'm going to welcome Crystal up to the stage, and also please submit your questions in the Q&A link, and I'll be back up to field questions with Crystal in a little bit. Thank you. Off to you, Crystal.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me this morning. Let me share my screen to get started with the presentation. And I can see the Q&A, so certainly feel free to put something in the Q&A or the chat if something comes up. So what am I going to be talking about today? So this morning I am going to go over what kind of an overview of what the Office of the State Auditor does. I am going to talk about, I know Dave Young touched on this a little bit, and I'm not sure to the extent he was able to cover this topic. So hopefully I'm going to be covering a little bit more detail about the accessibility law for folks with disabilities. And then I'm also going to talk about the Financial Transparency Act that is applicable for Colorado school districts. So, what does our office do? So we're responsible for the audit of the state of Colorado. And as independent auditors of the state, we serve without political affiliation. There are about 80 staff in our office. Carrie Hunter is our state auditor. She was appointed in July 2021 for a 5-year term. So in Colorado, our state auditor is appointed by the Legislative Audit Committee and then voted on by both houses of the General Assembly. Now, our audits typically fall into 3 broad categories: financial, performance, and information technology. And performance audits focus more on operations, effectiveness, compliance with statute, things like that. Now, our office also does some information technology audit work, some in conjunction with the statewide audit, and some work separately. For example, the IT team looks at information security policies specifics to the state's financial accounting system and other state systems, like the system that's used to collect sales and income taxes. Our office also has a dedicated team based on legislation a few years ago that looks at tax expenditures. Now, what are tax expenditures, you ask? Well, they are things like the income tax or sales tax credits, deductions, exemptions, things like that. We don't do audits in this area. It's an evaluation of the various types of tax expenditures to look at things like how the specific program might be performing compared to the original legislative intent, cost benefit analysis, those kinds of things. So if taxes is your jam, then you might want to look at some of this that's available on our website. Our peer review is through the National State Auditors Association, where we have folks from other state audit shops that come to do our peer review. Our most recent one was in May of 2024, where we received a rating of pass. And all of our audit reports go through the Legislative Audit Committee, which is a bipartisan permanent standing committee comprised of 4 state representatives and 4 senators representing both sides of the political parties. So we're responsible for auditing the state. That includes the departments of Treasury, Dave Young's department that you just heard from this morning, and the Department of Labor and Employment, Healthcare Policy and Finance. And the state's higher education institutions are considered part of the state of Colorado. and are combined in the state's ACFR. Now, they also issue their own separate financial statements, but they are combined in the state's ACFR. Now, we can't do all of that work ourselves, so we contract with outside CPA firms to do some of that work for us, for some of the higher eds and for some of the state departments like the Department of Transportation and Education. So the numbers on the slide help you put the state's size in perspective. And for example, in the last year's financial audit, the state's ACFR, there was close to 65 billion in total assets, 50.8 in total expenditures, over 20 of that was in federal funds. The largest federal program, of course, being the Medicaid program. Now let's talk about what's applicable for local governments in Colorado. As Michelle mentioned, there's over 4,000, really closer to 5,000 local governments in Colorado, and all of them are required to have an annual audit and submit that audit to our office, except there is an exemption that can be granted, an exception for governments that are so small that an audit's just not practical or affordable. Therefore, a smaller local government can request an exemption from audit. They have to fill out an application for exemption from audit with financial information if audit revenues or expenditures are under $1 million. So that exemption is not automatic. My team reviews every application and either approves or denies. And if denied, the local government is required to get an audit. If that threshold of $1 million sounds familiar, it is tied to the single audit threshold. The Legislative Audit Committee sponsored a bill just this year that increased the threshold effective for calendar year 2025 audits. Previous to that, the previous threshold was $750,000. Another factor that's a little bit different than what you heard from Ohio and Washington yesterday is that local governments are required to follow generally accepted governmental accounting principles, in other words, GASB, GAAP. The exemption forms are an exception, as some of them are prepared either on a cash basis or budget basis. But if an audit is required, it has to be conducted by an independent CPA or CPA firm hired by the local government themselves, and the financial statements have to be in compliance with GASB. Statute also outlines the deadlines for submissions. School districts in Colorado all have a June 30th year end, aligning with what the state does as well. And they have to have their audits submitted to us by the end of December. Or in other words, they have 6 months. Most of the other local governments, cities, towns, counties, special districts, all the other local governments have a December 31st year end. And they have a little more time. They have 7 months, or by today, they're required to have their audit in. Now, we do have the ability in statute to grant a 60-day extension, which in the current environment, we've already granted a lot of extensions for governments that couldn't get their audits done by today. Now, the duties of the state auditor is somewhat limited for local governments in Colorado. We don't have the statutory authority to audit local governments. They're required to hire their own independent auditor. Our statutory authority is limited to reviewing the audit report, sending what I call love letters to the governing body if we find a deficiency in financial reporting. Now, statute does give us a little more power if the local government does not submit their audit to us. If an audit is not submitted by the deadlines outlined in statute, they don't have an approved exemption from audit, the first power that we have is to send a notice to the county treasurer to hold all property taxes for the local government. Unfortunately, the statute is really pretty black and white on that point. If the audit or exemption is not submitted by the deadline, we have to place a hold on the taxes. And I don't have the ability in statute to grant exemptions, even in a case of hardship. The second power that we have is to cause an audit for a local government that's considered delinquent. When that happens, it's usually when the local government hasn't been able to find their own auditor, and then we would find an auditor for them. So we would contract with a CPA firm to conduct that audit. I've only had to do that once. I've been at the auditor's office for 17 years. Unfortunately, I've only had to do that once. Because we won't cause an audit and start the process of hiring a different auditor if a local government is late, if they've already got an audit in process. We don't want to get in the way of that, because that would just further delay. Okay, so now let's talk about what's referred to as the Digital Accessibility Law in Colorado. So the General Assembly passed several pieces of legislation starting in 2021 that requires all public entities, meaning governments in Colorado, to comply with digital accessibility standards for anything that's online. Now, the intent of the legislation, as I think I heard Dave mention earlier, was to ensure that people with disabilities can enjoy the same access to information as everyone else. Now, I want to point out that our office, the Colorado Office of the State Auditor, is not responsible for setting the standards, monitoring compliance, or any kind of oversight. It was the Governor's Office of Information Technology, or OIT, that was given that responsibility. Statute authorizes OIT to establish rules for accessibility for the whole state, for all public entities and state departments. So really, for the purposes of this presentation, a lot of the information that I have on my slides, I pulled directly from the governor's office website. So what do the rules apply to? So basically, it could be broadly interpreted to mean any electronic digital information that is available online or communicated, and the systems or websites that's publicly available. Now, legislation gave the original implementation date of July last year, but then there was a grace period granted, and so the true effective date was July 1st this year for everything to be updated and in place. Now, what does it apply to? So there was some leeway granted for anything that's not actively being used and something that may be archived. But as we've had discussions in our office, one has to be careful in defining what is not actively being used. For example, our office defined our archive as audit reports prior to 2010. We thought going back 15 years could be considered still in active use, but anything older than that, probably not. Now, an example of an active IT system would be the website in Colorado for an individual to apply for Medicaid. That website has to be in an accessible format. So what does that mean for something to be accessible? It means that the available information is presented so that if someone has some kind of disability, that they can still comprehend and understand the information that's being provided by the public entity. One example would be an individual who is vision impaired and is using a screen reader to read the information that's available online or use online services. Now, as well as some of the exceptions that I discussed of the information that's not in active use, there's other exceptions noted here. The most obvious being anything that is secure or would contain personally identifiable information. There's also definitions in statute of what constitutes an undue hardship or undue burden that's outlined in the statute. Now, there's guidance on the governor's website about how governments can be in compliance even if they're not able to make everything perfectly accessible. An example I could offer is if a public entity had a report posted and maybe they use WordPerfect from 2005. If the public entity has those older documents on their website, that older technology might be in a format that can't be made perfectly accessible. There could be old coding, hidden characters that a screen reader, in reading that document for someone who's vision impaired, wouldn't pick up everything that is perfectly understandable. And so one of the requirements that is established is to demonstrate compliance is to publish a accessibility statement. and also show other ways that which the entity is complying with the standards, such as how to request reasonable accommodations and the plan for updating any information that might not be perfectly accessible yet. So I pulled the accessibility statement from our website just to give you an example of what one looks like to demonstrate compliance. Now, what makes a document accessible? Well, it meets the requirements here that's defined in statute that makes it easy to read. You can search, navigate around the document. Legible is defined as a document that can be physically read by sighted readers, low vision readers, and readers with cognitive disabilities. Bottom line, even though Colorado's accessibility standard might not meet the same definitions of FDTA, there might be some elements that hopefully will help along the way when that standard becomes effective. And I'll give you the caveat, I am not a techie person, so I don't understand the underlying technology of what may make the difference between a document that meets accessibility standards in Colorado versus a machine reader format that may be effective once FDTA comes into play. We have a team in our legislative department that takes documents and reports and remediates them to make the document accessible. And even though most documents end up as a PDF, it all starts with a Word document. Using these tips in drafting documents has been very helpful for us, for our office, and we've had to kind of rethink how we even draft reports and how we format our documents. One of the examples is if you have an image, picture, pie chart, graph, anything like that, we have to think about how you would describe that image to someone with low vision. So that's what the alt text is for. It's just a simple description that says this is a pie chart that shows the breakout of the budget, or whatever that image is trying to convey in a document. If you're going to have a link, describe what is being linked and have the URL, not just a click here button without any background of understanding what an individual would be clicking to find. Font size largeable to make it readable. And one of the standards is if you have tables in your document, make sure the data has a header row to help orient the information that's being presented. Something else that we've learned to help make a document accessible, not just for someone who's vision impaired using a screen reader, but perhaps someone also with a learning disability, such as dyslexia. Don't use italics, because we've found that that makes a document harder to read if there's lots of italics in there for someone who's dyslexic. We don't use underlines except for a link, and nothing in all caps unless it's an acronym. And another example is someone who is colorblind or someone with a learning disability. Someone who's colorblind won't necessarily be able to differentiate between certain colors or colors that are close to each other. So that's why the guidance suggests a high color contrast. So now let's spend just the last couple of minutes talking about financial transparency that Colorado Public Schools have to follow. So, as you may have guessed by the limitations on what our office can do, even with auditing local governments, Colorado is a very strong local control state. Having said that, the Colorado Department of Education has more oversight responsibilities for school districts than any other state agency has over any other type of local government. For example, school districts are the only governments in Colorado that are required to follow a prescribed chart of accounts, and other types of local governments can use their own. School districts are also required to upload their trial balances to the Department of Education's website, and auditors have to say that they've audited that information as supplementary information and include mention of that in their audit opinion. The General Assembly has had a strong interest in financial transparency for public schools because of that link to state funding, and passed the Public School Financial Transparency Act over 15 years ago. Now, at that time, there were lots of things that a school district had to post on their individual district's website. And there were some of the required items, such as quarterly financial reports and the check registers and investment performance reports, that was subsequently repealed. So, fast forward a few years, and in 2014, the General Assembly passed further legislation that required CDE to build a website and districts to report expenditure information down to the school site level. And so the link to CDE's website is on this slide. So this slide just shows one example of information. I pulled Akron School District. Akron is a smaller community and smaller school district that's on the Eastern Plains of Colorado. There's a list of all of the things that's required to be there by statute, their budget. They have to link to their financial audit, salary schedules, that financial data file that I talked about that's required, as well as a link that is the same link actually, but it goes directly to their school district for financial transparency. So you can either go to the Financial Transparency Act from CDE's website or from an individual school district's website. And so drilling down to financial transparency, this slide shows you details, for example, about the number of students and expenditures per students. And one of the elements that you can drill down to is per the individual school building. I pulled details from Golden High School. It's where my girls graduated high school. And it shows comparisons of the most recent year to the previous 3 years. A little further down on the page, it shows the breakout of expenditures for instruction, activities, and student support. And then you can also pick 2 schools to compare. So I picked Akron High School and Golden High School, and you can see they're vastly different in terms of size. And it shows the number of schools in the district. Jefferson County is a larger school district in Colorado. It has 148 schools in its district, where Akron School District only has 2 schools in it, the elementary school and then the high school. I'm assuming it's the elementary and middle in Akron. And I think Jefferson County enjoys some economies of scale, which is why there's a big difference between total spending per student than you have in a smaller school building that only serves 121 students. So how does our office use financial data? So our office performs an annual fiscal health analysis of Colorado school districts, and the link to the latest report is at the top of this slide. Now, we have 6 ratios that we review the trends over the most recent 3 fiscal years, and our last report was released by the Legislative Audit Committee in October of last year. I mentioned earlier that school districts have requirements to submit their financial data to CDE, and that's basically their trial balances for each fund. However, we currently don't have the technology or the capability to use that electronic system to perform our analysis, to pull that into our system to analyze the data. So because we're using information from the audited financial statements themselves. Now, as technology improves and all financial statements maybe go in the direction of machine readability and exploring the use of some AI tools, we might be able to develop in the future a little more automated way to analyze that information. But for now, we perform the data entry ourselves and rely on an Access database and Excel to actually analyze the information. So I've provided a couple of links that might be useful, including a link to our annual report that tells a little bit more about our office, kind of a high-level overview of last year's activities. The link to the governor's OIT office, as well as repeating the Colorado Department of Education financial transparency. And so here's my contact information. And I'm giving you the caveat that we're moving offices later this year. So this mailing address will change, but of course the rest of my contact information. Well, I think we've got a few minutes left over. So I am going to stop my share, and thanks, Michelle, for coming back on. I didn't see anything come across in the Q&A.
Yeah, just a reminder to everyone, and I have a few questions if you don't mind. Just a reminder to our audience, if you do have questions for Crystal, please post them in the Q&A, and we'll take them over the next. We have a few minutes that we can take questions now before we run off to our next session. So I do have a couple of questions, and it was interesting to me to see the Colorado school districts, because I was doing this in conjunction with Christine Kuglin from University of Denver. We did a project where we actually looked at the chart of accounts for school districts, and we developed, which is very interesting. And we developed a taxonomy that represents the school districts, and we actually created some machine readable financial statement data for specific school districts. So it was pretty interesting. And it seems like, so you're taking, so they collect a lot of data. It's all in a standardized chart of accounts.
Mhm.
How long does it take you to key that data in? Since you don't have a system, you can't automatically extract that data, because you're providing a huge amount of analytics, which is great,
Sure,
but
sure.
it's a lot of work.
It is a fair amount of work, but the way we perform that work is we're reviewing every audit report anyway. You know, we're
Okay.
looking for compliance with the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. As I mentioned, sending a love letter if we see something that is amiss in their disclosure
Mhm.
requirements, for example. So as we're doing that review, we are doing the data entry kind of at the same time.
Okay.
So yeah, it does take an extra few minutes, but fortunately there's only 178 school districts. So it's not overly burdensome to be able to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm wondering, like, you're able to do this analysis on school districts, and it does, the data that you're collecting does get down to a pretty granular level into like number of students, and then you can do various metrics against that, I imagine. Um, if the FDTA moves forward as we expect, and data from, other types of governments, other special districts and general purpose governments
Right.
is available in machine readable format, how would that change the way that you work in the auditor's office?
You know, I think it would certainly provide some ease. We do have a limited analysis that we perform for select special districts.
Okay.
Statute tells us to report a special district, which includes metropolitan districts and those kinds of things, to the Department of Local Affairs if we notice an issue with the district being able to pay their debt, for example.
Mhm.
But it's not all of them, because there are 3,000, I think, you know, 2 to 3,000 special districts in Colorado. So certainly having things in a machine readable format and having AI technology that I think could easily extract that information, I think would be able to expand our reach a little bit,
Mhm.
and provide that information. We do
Right.
have a tool on our website for cities and counties to do their own fiscal health analysis,
Mhm.
but as I mentioned, Colorado is a very strong local control state. So
Oh,
cities and counties were not interested in us preparing a report that we publish that shows the
Mhm.
fiscal health analysis of cities and counties. So,
Hmm.
maybe
Interesting.
that would be something that would be available on our website.
Mhm.
Not unlike what I saw in the Hinkle system
Mhm.
yesterday, for Ohio, and even what Washington is able to have available on their
Right,
website as well. Yeah.
right. Yeah, so one of the things that it seems like if you, like today, you may be doing, analysis on kind of selected entities. But if all of that data was available in the same structured format, then you could do, you could analyze, 3,000 entities at the same time
Yeah.
as you would do three today. So,
Absolutely. I mean, as it stands right now, we just simply don't have the resources or the technology capability to be
Mhm.
able to do that.
Right, right. No, that makes sense. Um, and I'm wondering, we've been talking about the auditor's office, but how might other state level divisions use that data? Are there other divisions within the state of Colorado that
Sure.
use the data today, and how do you think that would change for them?
So I know that the Department of Local Affairs does
Mhm.
grants, for example, some of them federal, some of them state funded. And I would think it is, they do get our information. You can on our website. Um, we have a local government portal that you can, through our office, see local government financial statements that they have sent to us.
Okay.
And that's an example of something that's in the older technology that we don't produce. It's a third party document that we're just providing access to through our
Mhm.
website. So it's
Okay.
not going to be perfectly accessible for folks with disabilities. But
Mhm.
right now, that is a more manual process for the Department of Local Affairs, for example, to look at city and county financial statements to determine need, and
Mhm.
when deciding grants. So I think certainly it would help that process as well, and
Right.
it might provide, even though CDE has information kind of at the granular level, it might provide them with additional
Mhm.
information to use for decision making.
That's great. And you had mentioned artificial intelligence, and I think one of the exciting things about AI, that we're starting to use AI more and more in things that we do,
Yeah.
from conducting analysis to even developing graphics for some things that we do, which is very fun. Um, but what we found is that when AI algorithms are run against structured data, you can very quickly generate analysis that is very consistent and more accurate. And so I think having, if a lot of that government data is available in structured machine readable format, then with an AI kind of on top of that, you can
Mhm.
do so much more analysis really quickly and really with a high level of integrity, which is really important. So,
Yeah, that would be.
okay. Well, we're running out of time, and I'm sorry we're running over, but this is really interesting. Do you have any final words of advice for other auditors, other state auditors around the country?
Well, I would just say, keep fighting the good fight. Certainly
Mhm.
auditors are very important, not only at the local government level, but at the state oversight level as well. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to let you take off, go in
Okay.
and join for our other sessions. We have a couple of
Okay.
CPE questions that we need to do right now, so I will cover
Okay.
those first before we run off to the next session.